As I rise to oppose this bill, there are 19 Australians standing strong on the ship that they make a living on, the MV Portland, and it's refusing to take its final journey from Portland in Victoria to Singapore. The owners of the ship, Alcoa, are poised to sack the Australian workers, choosing instead to employ a low-paid foreign crew on its route between Western Australia and Victoria. And their plight is indicative of the coastal shipping industry as a whole. It's a sector that's doing its best to stay put, but copping rough seas in every direction, particularly from the Turnbull government with this bill. We all well know, that our nation is girt by sea, and it's vital because of that we have a strong local shipping sector. Shipping carries the vast majority of Australia's trade. In a single year, ships moved nearly 1 billion tonne of goods, worth about $200 million, in and out of our ports, employing 14,000 people at sea or on shore. People like those on board the MV Portland right now. And these volumes of domestic freight are on the increase. What we should be doing is everything we can to support these people maintain their livelihood. But instead of that, the Abbott-Turnbull government is cutting them loose with this bill, which continues the attacks on people in the workplace that we have seen all too often. And the current challenges are coming from two directions. The industry has to compete with subsidised land freight sectors and particularly with international ships using much, much cheaper foreign labour, where Australian seafarers have to be paid award wages. We have international foreign labour being paid $2 an hour. But instead of addressing these challenges with the industry and with the workers, the government has made these challenges all the more difficult. Instead of facilitating ways to strengthen our local industry, to overcome the fact that we are a high-wage nation, the government's trying to push through this bill that's going to decimate what's left of Australian coastal shipping. And instead of standing with the workers, this government has embarked on a race to the bottom on workplace rights in the shipping industry. Through this bill, the government wants to force Australian-flagged ships to compete with low-cost foreign operators that don't have the same responsibility to their workers in terms of minimum wage and working conditions. Over the weekend, I was contacted by a seafarer by the name of Chris, and Chris said, "After spending years of training and hard work on our careers, this situation is heartbreaking for my peers and myself. The possibility is real. If this goes ahead, we will no longer have the opportunity to be employed in our own country. Nearly all of us will have to take our skills overseas or seek a new career." He continued that it beggars belief that our own government, which is meant to represent us, is seeking to put us out of a job. The Turnbull government is hanging Chris and his workmates out to dry. The reforms introduced by the previous government to coastal shipping have only been in place since 2012, not nearly enough time for the reforms to take effect. But with this bill, the government is tearing them down. The intention is clear: to deregulate Australian shipping until we have next to no local industry left. The cost-benefit analysis accompanying this bill says it all. It shows the estimate is that only 88 Australian seafarers, or 7% of the current workforce, will still have their jobs if these changes go through. 93% of Australian seafarers currently operating in coastal shipping will lose their jobs. This is what this legislation means. So, apart from the Spirit of Tasmania, Australian crewed ships will be entirely eliminated, and the rest of our coastline will only end up with foreign workers who are not subject to our country's standards. This week, I met another seafarer called Mick, Mick now currently, he is a pilot. He pilots ships into the port of Botany, including oil tankers. It's a really important job, really important that it's done well, that it's done with every safety regulation, every workplace control in place. He had 15 years' experience at sea before he became a pilot. Where is this experience going to come from if we have got a maritime sector that only includes 88 Australian seafarers in our coastal trade? We won't have it. That's the reality. We'll be saying, oh no, we've got a labour shortage. We haven't got people who have got the skills to be pilots. We'll be importing Indian and Filipino pilots on 457 visas who don't know the Australian conditions, who don't know the Australian waters, who haven't done Australian training. Or we will have training courses to become a pilot, which are all very well in theory, and so they can tick off, in theory that yes, they've done all these training courses. But then those pilots will be lacking experience, and it's experience that counts when situations get really, really tricky. So the government says these changes are inevitable. But independent assessments submitted to the committee who examined this bill looked at the regulatory impact statement and the cost-benefit analysis underpinning this bill, and this assessment shows that there aren't documents that provide a sound basis for decision-making or for policy development. Both largely ignore the economic context of the coastal shipping industry and contain omissions and have a number of technical flaws. You would think that people working in Australian waters should be subject to our country's proud tradition of high workplace standards. But no, what the government is proposing is one rule for land-based jobs and another for work being carried out on water in Australia. Earlier this year, I got an insight into life on board a foreign-flagged ship that was anchored in Yarraville. And this ship was working for CSR, it was operating the coastal trade, it was largely being run by a foreign crew. It was operating for CSR, it was plying the east coast with sugar to be refined in Yarraville. The mostly Filipino seafarers who are on this ship were having major issues with undrinkable water and their pay and conditions. They were being supported by the International Seafarers Union to be trying to get some recourse and some redress for the conditions they were facing. But it was a hard slog that they were having to face in order to just get basic quality conditions. As it ended up, with the support of the International Union, they managed to get the Russian captain of the ship removed from the ship and replaced by another captain. Is this what we want for our coastal shipping trade? It's not what we want for Australian shipping. We are a wealthy enough country that we can afford to be looking after our workers, looking after our coast and making sure that the conditions that are operating along our coast are the conditions that we should be proud of as Australians. These changes will hit our tourism sector as well. The Australian coastal tourism operators simply won't be able to compete with foreign flag vessels that employ foreign labour. It doesn't make sense. They wouldn't have that problem if their business was on an inland river or a lake, but making sense is not what this bill is about. At the recent Senate hearing into this bill, the evidence showed that the government is happy to leave local marine tourism operators out to dry. We've heard plenty in this place, both as part of the inquiry and reported in this place, about the West Australian cruise operator Bill Milby from North Star Cruises, who submitted evidence to the inquiry that the government's own senior bureaucrats had advised him to reflag his vessel overseas and replace his 50 Australian workers with foreign crew. He didn't want to do that. He wanted to be able to support his workers. He didn't want to dump his local workers. But he felt he was being advised to do that, and he would have to do that in order to compete with foreign flag vessels. This isn't the situation that we want. We have to be able to have a way forward to keep those jobs here in Australia. These laws won't just impact on the rights and wages of people at work, however. They will have a massive environmental impact too. because the more freight that we can get onto ships means that we can have fewer trucks on our roads and lower greenhouse gas emissions. And if the traffic in our coastal waters is not properly managed, our marine environment, particularly the Great Barrier Reef, will be put at risk. We'll be seeing more of the disasters like the Shen Neng one, which spilt oil onto the reef in 2010. Foreign flag vessels have a very high rate of detentions, and they are not subject to the rigour that we set here in Australia for our own vessels. And if we look at the number of shipping occurrences reported to the Australian Traffic Safety Bureau in the period 2005 to 2012, we see 611 vessels registered in another country reported, almost triple that of reports for Australian vessels. Why are we risking our fisheries, our coastal environment, our Great Barrier Reef? And one of the big issues with these foreign flag vessels coming in to be doing our coastal trade is that they might only be here once or twice. There is no incentive for them to be complying with the local legislations, even if they know that they're, in theory, not meant to be. In theory, they have to comply with those legislations. If they don't, so what? You know, they're not going to be back for another year or so. Compared with our local coastal, our Australian domestic ships, which know that they have to keep the standards up because they know that the whole business depends upon it. So the Greens will not be supporting this bill. This government, as we know, wants to rip our nation's workplace standards to shreds. This bill is not going to live up to its promise to strengthen Australia's coastal shipping industry. It will provide little economic benefit, it will see the demise of the remaining Australian coastal trading ships, and it will mean local jobs are lost. The shipping industry is not something that we should just let flounder. There is opportunity for growth in Australian shipping, but the government and all sectors of the industry are going to have to work together to realise this potential. Last night, I attended the dinner being put on by the Maritime Industries of Australia Limited, and we heard from the Norwegian ambassador, who was telling us about the maritime industry in Norway, what the growth of the maritime industry in Norway is based upon. It was very interesting to hear from Norway because they, like Australia, are a high-wage country, but they have got a shipping industry which is growing and in fact provides 38% of their export income. Of the whole country, 38% of Norway's export income comes from their maritime sector. And the whole basis of the success and the strength of their maritime sector is based upon having government and the industry working together. It's based on innovation, it's based on a willingness for the industry to take risk, and it's about supporting the whole sector supporting itself and with government support, and government taking a role to work out what needs to happen in order to grow the industry. They've got maritime clusters that bring whole different sectors of the industry together to support each other. These are the sorts of directions that we should be heading, but it's not going to happen unless we have a government that is actually committed to seeing what the growth in the shipping industry is going to be, rather than this presumption, which this bill has, that no, the Australian shipping industry is just going to disappear. So, fundamentally, that growth, that the potential of the shipping industry needs to be based upon presuming that, yes, we are going to be having ongoing high wages and they are compatible with the growth in the industry. And any seafarer, whether they're in a foreign registered ship operating under licence in the Australian coastal trade or working on an Australian ship, has to be subject to Australian industrial relations laws. We have to maintain our workplace standards and ensure a level playing field for shipping operators. Last night at the dinner and at the shipping summit that was organised by the ACTU recently, the overwhelming message from the industry was the need for certainty. And they will not get that certainty if this legislation is passed. And it's inevitable. If we pass this legislation, a change of government means we will be back to the drawing board. We will be lurching from one set of legislation to another, completely undermining that certainty which is what's needed to underpin growth and development in the industry. At the dinner last night, I spoke to a whole range of different representatives from companies that were working in this sector, but ranging from Rio Tinto to other container operators. And the thing that they said to me, the overwhelming message, just like the overwhelming message from the ACTU Shipping Summit, was that we need certainty. We need to know that they can invest with certainty, that the conditions aren't going to change, that the legislation's not going to change from government to government. So I really want to thank those that submitted to the inquiry into this bill and to the broader conversation. And those voices, like the Maritime Industry Australia, the Maritime Union of Australia and the Australian Institute of Marine and Power Engineers, and many others who have had critical input to the inquiry and to the debate more broadly. And I know from talking to them that most of those stakeholders do not want to see this legislation passed, because they know that it is not going to be the interest in growth and bringing them together and to be working out and to be having a consistent, on-lasting framework to be developing the industry. I think what the Greens are calling upon the government to do, and I think, you know, if we reject this legislation today, what then the opportunity is then there to go back to the drawing board and to say, OK, where do we go to from here? And that is to bring all sectors of the industry together to determine as much as possible a consensus way forward for the industry that's going to stand the test of time. The Maritime Union of Australia, they've put forward some suggestions. They know that there are changes that need to be made to the current legislation, and they've put forward some suggestions of key areas that they would like to see changed, to streamline the administration of the licensing provisions, to clarify the object of the Act, to remove ambiguity and specify that the primary object is to promote Australian participation in coastal shipping, to provide for differential licence application and grant requirements, and removing the one-size-fits-all approach, that recommendation is also consistent with the majority report of the Senate inquiry into the bill, and to streamline the contestability provisions. The MUA have got suggestions, the industry across the board, different stakeholders have got different suggestions. We have to have a situation where we can be bringing people together, to be working together, to be working collaboratively together, to develop the framework, the legislative framework and the platform so that we can have that certainty, so that we know that elements of the industry can invest with certainty, so that we can be moving forward and to be having a maritime industry that is based on growth, that's based on innovation and is going to take us forward so that we really can be maximising the potential and the opportunities of the Australian shipping industry.